What is going on, guys? Welcome to my latest top 10, which is going to be talking about the absolute worst horror franchises in my opinion. Now, one thing I need to get out of the way, I have not watched every single horror film out there. I have not watched every single horror franchise, so there are likely other franchises out there that are significantly worse than the ones that are going to be on my top 10. The only ones that I'm including are franchises that I have in fact watched every single entry from start to finish. Kicking it right off with number 10, I have the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Now, don't get me wrong, this, among a couple of other franchises I'm going to be talking about, have movies that are among the best of all time, but they don't make for very good franchises. And the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one of the absolute worst in my mind because they can never pick a direction, and they have absolutely bled anything that this franchise has as far as potential to give more stories to death. This is the horror franchise that has tried to reboot itself and reset itself more than any others that I have seen. I mean, you look at the first film, that's its own individual thing. It's one of the most celebrated horror films of all time. Never been one of my personal favorites, but over time, I've started to appreciate it more and more. Then you have a stark difference with the second film that's very much dark comedy. Then you get to the fourth film, yet again, trying to reboot, be a direct sequel to the first one, have no idea what the hell they were doing with that one. Then we get the remake in 2003, which is my personal favorite, and those two movies, this and The Beginning, are the only two that feel like a consistent 1-2 punch here. And then we get into Leatherface, and we get into the Texas Chainsaw movie that came on Netflix. I mean, every single time they pivot, it's just completely different direction, different cast, different timeline. Leatherface is iconic. The original film's iconic. For me and for many others in my generation, the remake is iconic, but there are so many misfires in this franchise that it's one that's rough to get through and rough to recommend. But really quick before we continue on with this top 10, while we may speak the same language as far as our movie taste goes, a lot of us have different native tongues. And if you, like me, want to self-improve this year and achieve a goal of becoming multilingual, check out the sponsor of this video, Babbel. Over the past year, I've been focusing a lot on challenging myself for self-improvement. And I have personally always wanted to be fluent in a second language to better connect with others. Not to mention, it'd be a pretty cool flex to be able to watch a foreign film without the subtitles. Well, to achieve that goal, I've turned to Babbel, which is a learning app that is scientifically proven to help you start speaking a new language in just 3 weeks. And Babbel achieves this by teaching you real-world conversations. Lessons designed by real language teachers prepare you to have practical conversations about travel, business, relationships, and more. And you can do these lessons from your desktop or your mobile phone.
El autobús.
El autobús.
El tren.
El tren.
La parada.
La parada. Most people know me llamo means my name is, and gracias means thank you, but can you ask for the check at your favorite Mexican restaurant? Me trae la cuenta, por favor. Find out why Babbel is one of the top language learning apps in the world by using the link in the video description and getting 60% off on your subscription. And be sure to leave a comment below on what language you'd like to learn. And muchas gracias to Babbel for sponsoring today's video. Coming in at number 9 for me is going to be the Exorcist franchise. And much like with Texas Chainsaw, the Exorcist franchise has one of the most celebrated and beloved and most influential horror films of all time in the original Exorcist. And much like with Texas Chainsaw, my hot take with this one again is that Exorcist 3 is actually my personal favorite. I think that's one of the creepiest and one of the best horror films of all time. And the original, I've always appreciated it a bit more than I enjoy it. But much like with the original Texas Chainsaw, the more that I watch it, the more that I appreciate it. But everything else in this franchise can basically go fuck itself. You got Exorcist 2, The Heretic. Every single time that I have reviewed a horror franchise that I have not already previously seen every single film in it, there's always at least one movie that everybody loves to warn me about and get excited for the review, or they're like, ooh, that one's gonna be crazy, that one's gonna be terrible, can't wait to hear you rant on that one. And I'd say 8 out of 10 times, they usually are overhyped and oversold with how bad they're being. And by the time I actually see it, I'm like, yeah, you know, it's bad. It's probably the worst of the franchise, but it's fine. I've seen worse. Exorcist 2, The Heretic, genuinely one of the worst films I've ever seen in my life. Just baffling decisions all around with that one. You have all of the craziness involved with the 2 prequels with Exorcist the Beginning and Dominion. You can research what happened with that one. Basically 2 completely different movies were shot and they ended up releasing both of them because nobody cared for either one of them. I don't care for either one of them very much. And then last year we had The Exorcist Believer, which ended up in my top 10 worst films of 2023, and I saw 121 of them, so that's pretty fucking bad. And already since then, David Gordon Green has left the rest of the trilogy, and it's just a complete in shambles project at this point. I would not be surprised if they pull the plug on it and just wait and just completely reboot itself again and act like Exorcist Believer didn't happen. But we'll see. There's supposed to be 2 more of these films. The Exorcist is one of those movies that just should have never been a franchise. For as much as I love Exorcist 3, The Exorcist should have been a one and done. That is a story that is self-contained, it wraps up, it tells its story, it makes its point, and there's not really any sense in continuing on with those characters, with that story, and this franchise is evidence of that. Coming in at number 8, another beloved original film followed by a bunch of bullshit, and that is the Jaws franchise. Jaws is genuinely one of the greatest films ever made. Of the 3 franchises I've talked about so far, Jaws is the one that I'm completely on board for. I mean, timeless, absolutely masterfully made, still creepy, still gut-wrenching, still riveting to this day. Amazing characters, the effects still hold up very well for me. I mean, it's still responsible for making people terrified to go into the ocean. But everything after the original, I mean, just like with Exorcist, why more? It just makes no sense. There's another fucking shark that decides to attack this beach. I mean, I used to like Jaws 2 when I was a kid. When I watched it a couple of years ago for a 31 on 31 that we did with a bunch of creature features, it went way down for me, to where it's watchable, it's fine, it's tolerable, but I'll probably never watch it again unless I'm just binging through the franchise, and I don't know why the fuck I'd be doing that. Jaws 3, I could see if you were there, maybe having some nostalgia for how silly it is with the 3D effects, but Jaws 4, that is either one of the worst films ever made or one of the most guilty pleasures that you are guilty as fuck for mentioning. I mean, it's just an absolutely bonkers concept. A shark that literally hunts down and targets this family and follows them down to the Bahamas, and you know, it has all these cognitive abilities, and there's this psychic ability that the mom from the original suddenly has. Woof. I mean, it's a bad franchise. This is a franchise where you watch the first one, you love the first one because we all love the first one, and then you stop and pretend that nothing else happened afterwards. Number 7, possibly the most squandered potential of a franchise on this list, in my own opinion, and that is Jeepers Creepers. Now, I know that there's the extra layer of ickiness that would probably put this on most people's worst franchises, which is the legacy, the infamy of the director Victor Salva. I'm not going to get into any of that here. I hear you. I understand. For me personally, I adore the original movie. I saw it long before I knew anything about that. I actually saw the first 2 movies long before I knew anything about Victor Salva, and it's one of those films that I can separate the art from the artist. The first film blew me away when I first saw it. It's still one of my favorite horror films of all time. I think it's damn near perfect to me. The second film I have fun with, but it's flawed as hell, and that one, significantly more than the first one, is definitely tainted a bit by my knowledge of Victor Salva, because there's a lot of creative choices in that second film that just feel a bit uncomfortable when you know what he did. 3 and 4, what the fuck? I mean, I remember watching the third one. I remember reviewing the third one. I remember ranking this franchise with just the first 3 films and saying that there is no possible way that they can make a movie worse than Jeepers Creepers 3. Just an absolute empty, garbage attempt to keep the Jeepers Creepers name going. Now, honestly, there was a lot of things that were put into the way of Victor Salva that prevented him from making the movie that he wanted to make, for understandable reasons, but it is fair to mention that. But the movie that we got was just like a teaser for the movie that we actually wanted to see. It did nothing. The effects were garbage. All the green screen. I mean, Jonathan Breck still looked pretty good in the makeup, but other than that, what a garbage movie. Then we had Jeepers Creepers Reborn. Wow. I mean, I was one of the few people that actually was excited whenever I read the news that the Victor Salva had either sold the rights or they yanked the rights away from him, and there was going to be a brand new production company taking over the franchise for a 4th film. And I was like, well, finally, maybe people will be a little bit more open to seeing it. Maybe there won't be quite as much ickiness with it. Maybe they'll take it in a new direction because I don't know what the fuck he was trying to do with 3. And I held on to that hope all the way until I drove almost 2 hours away and paid double the price to see a Fathom event to watch this thing in theaters. And my God, Jeepers Creepers Reborn, one of the most incompetently made movies I've ever seen. I don't know if there is a single shot in that movie that is not in front of a green screen. The effects are, they hurt your eyes that they are so bad. I mean, even just people standing outside in the woods, it has this weird gloss to it and everything is so brightly lit because they're in front of a blue or a green screen. The characters are terrible. The acting is terrible. They recast the Creeper and this person has nothing on what Jonathan Breck did, and he just looked goofy as hell. Like when he crawled out of his little cocoon, looked like this weird like bat baby. You have these goofy ass scenes in the end. It borders on so bad that it's good. I could understand somebody watching this and just laughing their ass off after a couple of drinks, but when I was crushed just watching this, like, you could have done something, and you did this. Why? It's a franchise that I will be surprised if we ever see another film, because the legacy of those last 2 are just so horrendous. Paired with the infamy of the director, I think it's dead. So this, much like with Jaws, you have the first one of my favorites of all time, and I could tolerate watching the second one, but beyond that, nothing else happened. You know, it ends in the barn with the guy just pointing that giant harpoon and saying, give or take a day or 2. That's it. It's the end of this franchise. Number 6 is going to be a little franchise called Critters. I'm sorry, Brian. I love you. This is one of my buddy Brian Lomax's favorite franchises, at least the first 2 movies, and he picked this back when we did 31 on 31 creature features, and basically everybody but Brian hated most of this franchise, so we continue to give him shit to this day for making us watch these. But to be fair to Critters, and why it's not even higher up this list for as much shit as I give it, it's a franchise that knows what it is. You know, it's a Gremlins ripoff that's going for much more the B-movie, sci-fi type thing. The first film, enjoyable enough if you're in the mood for it. Just a very simple concept. This family on this farmhouse, and these little alien fuzzballs come, and they're chewing through everything. I actually prefer the second film, because the second film is a little bit more B-movie, has a little bit more fun with the concept. There's more gore, there's more krites, and so the first 2, if I'm in the mood, which is a rarity, because I have not been in the mood to watch it since I covered it for that 31 on 31. They're decent enough. They know what they're doing. But Critters 3 and Critters 4 and the one that was on Netflix, I believe, those are pretty terrible. I mean, the third one I remember watching as a kid and kind of always having a bit of a likeness to it just because Leonardo DiCaprio was in it. I never saw the whole movie. It was always on like Cinemax or something. I'd see like pieces of it. But it's a pretty dreadful movie, and it's a movie that I can imagine he probably never wants to discuss again. You know, he's one of those A-listers that likes to pretend he didn't start in horror. The fourth one has an exciting cast. I mean, you got Brad Dourif, a couple other familiar faces in there, but it's in space. And while the Krites kind of make sense to be in space because they're from space, it has all the same problems that all these horror franchises have when they eventually reach space, which is that the production value is just so low that it doesn't really convincingly put you into a space setting. I don't think that the futuristic tone of the movie really does much for the concept or the Krites. And the Netflix one, aside from a couple of decent kills, a couple of like CGI gore kills, I don't remember jack shit about that movie. So Critters, never been one of my favorites, will always be the thing that I give Brian Lomax shit for, will always be the card that I pull whenever I do things like make us rank Saw and Hellraiser and all those together. And I'm like, yeah, but you made us watch Critters. You know, those 5 movies, you're still paying for it, Brian. Number 5 is going to be Leprechaun. And this, very much like Critters, is a franchise that knows what it is. So if I'm in the mood for it, I can have fun with how bad that it is. I've always enjoyed the first film ever since I was a kid. It's definitely low-hanging fruit, but it's entertaining. It's goofy. The second film has its moments. The third film, if you're a gore hound, probably has the best kills and leans much more into the slasher, like bloodlust of a lot of slasher fans. So that one is a bit fun to watch. Everything after that doesn't do anything for me. I mean, this probably has the worst in space chapter. With the fourth film, there's lightsabers and shit. It tries to have some self-aware fun, but I just don't ever really enjoy watching that one. Leprechaun in the Hood has its fans. I've never found it to be particularly funny and particularly clever, and even less so the second film. When they tried to reboot this, they failed miserably with Leprechaun Origins. I don't know who the fuck signed off on that. It has nothing to do with Leprechaun, and I legitimately think that was like some weird monster movie and they just slapped Leprechaun on there to try to be able to sell it. They don't even show, was it Hornswoggle? He was a WWE wrestler and he was taking over the role for Warwick Davis, and they never show him. It's like a creature that's just in flashes. It was the weirdest thing ever. Then they tried to reboot it again with Leprechaun Origins, and I can have some decent fun with that one. I like the fact that it's like a direct sequel to the original. You bring back Ozzy. There's some direct little callbacks. I think that the guy that puts on the performance as the Leprechaun does actually a pretty decent Warwick Davis impersonation. So that one is watchable to me. So 3 movies out of what, 7 or 8 of them, but this is a franchise that you have to be in the mood for. And even when you're in the mood for it, it's still a bit of a struggle to get through most of them. Even my buddy Sean Chandler, I think like 2 or 3 years ago, he was talking about doing a Leprechaun ranking or Leprechaun review series, and he watched through like 4 or 5 of them, and he canceled the review series because he told me I couldn't think of anything positive to say about any of them. So most people that watch them, that's going to be their experience. Coming in at number 4 for me is going to be Paranormal Activity. Now, I need to say this clearly. I am not a fan of found footage. I can count on probably 3 fingers how many found footage movies I genuinely like. I think the concept for this was interesting. It's not really a shock to me why it was this massive success, one of Blumhouse's first big massive successes. It was kind of the house that built Blumhouse in a lot of way. But the first film, the first 2 or 3, I think were an interesting concept to explore. The third one's probably the one that I enjoy the most, the 90s vibe to it, but it's a concept that just gets stretched way too fucking far throughout this franchise. And every single movie has the same problem, to where there's an interesting idea that you can appreciate when you first get into the movies, but all of them spend about an hour with just about nothing happening. Like maybe a cabinet will close, or maybe there'll be like a little shadow that puts on the Ring camera or something weird, but it just slowly, meticulously builds this very deliberate pace for the first hour or more. And then shit gets crazy for about 10 minutes and then the movie cuts off. And I don't think that at any point in this franchise I ever reached a really satisfying point with having answers for things that were brought up even in the first film. Like, it just kept going and kept artificially keeping itself alive by not answering things. So while this movie franchise has its fans and, specifically people that love found footage and what found footage does, I get it. But for me, I can appreciate the first couple of movies. There's moments throughout them that are cool for like maybe a TikTok or a clip or something, but they are a chore to get through. Now, really quick before I dive into my top 3 worst horror franchises, I want to let you know that this is actually a Patreon pick video. In fact, the second Patreon pick video of January 2024. Patreon is my crowdfunding source for the longest time before I went full time. That was where I got most of the financial support that to keep this channel going, to continue to improve my equipment, to continue to be able to dedicate more time and more money and resources to building out this channel. All of my biggest and best supporters are the ones that make up my Patreon, and can never be grateful enough for what those guys do. There's a number of different tiers, all with different perks. I do things like exclusive live streams and Q&As. Whenever I get a video done early, I'll give them early access to it. I try to give away some Blu-ray digital copy codes here and there, the ones that I get in all of my off-the-shelves videos. And the Patreon pick is something that I try to do every single month, where I let them brainstorm a bunch of ideas for video ideas they'd like me to put on the channel, and then I do a poll, and whichever one wins out ends up becoming a video. This month I wanted to do 2, and so top 10 worst horror franchises is an idea that came directly from my patrons. So consider checking that out down below in a link as well if you enjoy what I do and want to help contribute to that. Coming in at number 3 is going to be Hellraiser. You knew it was going to be on here somewhere. This is probably the most popular answer in my circles, at least, for worst horror franchise. It's the one that most people acknowledge acknowledge the massive issues with the franchise while having their picks for favorites. Very much like the first couple of entries on this list, I've never been a massive fan of the original. I certainly enjoy it for what it is, and if I'm in the mood for it, I can dig what it does well, which is just a lot of gore and sadomasochism and some craziness that is very unique to the Hellraiser franchise. I have fun with the third one. Third one's a little bit more of like an 80s slasher take on this, where the Cenobites get to be the slasher villains and kind of get to have a little bit more gory fun. I think that the remake was very well done. It came very close to topping the original for me, and I really hope that we do get a sequel to that, and hopefully David Bruckner comes back to that, but the fact that I haven't heard anything about it kind of makes me feel that that might not happen. The rest of the franchise, I can pretty much take or leave, with a number of them being movies that I will never watch again. And the issue with this franchise is that for decades, they never understood what the appeal of Hellraiser was. They never understood what fans wanted to see, what fans wanted to explore. And so you get the first couple of movies that do a decent enough job with that. The Cenobites were very much an intentional background threat in the first film, and they work well with that. The second film is very odd. It has its fans. Some people prefer that to the original. I'm not one of them. And 3 and 4 have fun with the concept, but everything after 4 just gets into this rut, and this repetitive rut of it clearly being some generic thriller, cop, investigation, murder mystery script that was just sitting around on some producer's desk collecting dust. They blew the dust off, they wrote Pinhead into like 2 or 3 pages, and then called it a Hellraiser film. And you have that for the majority of this franchise. Just movies that are artificially molded into being a Hellraiser film and have little to nothing to do with Hellraiser. Not until the much maligned Hellraiser Revelations does a movie feel like an actual Hellraiser movie in this franchise after the 4th film. And so that's one of the reasons why this has been infamous as one of the worst horror franchises and most people's least favorite horror franchise, because it's just decades and movie after movie after movie of them just kind of doing Hellraiser and just aping the name and using the brand recognition to sell these generic as fuck scripts that none of which really have much merit to them. And the ultimate shame of it all is that while he's not one of my favorites, Pinhead might be the most badass looking horror icon in the entire genre. I mean, that guy in and of itself, as well as the other Cenobites, are just so fucking cool and fascinating to watch, and just such wicked designs and makeup and practical effects, and they just never really got utilized to their potential, really until the remake. The remake was the first one that was like, oh yeah, the Cenobites, they're the star of the show, they need to be the main threat, and they need to be the impending doom that is propelling the story forward, which is why I really want to see a sequel. So just right next to Jeepers Creepers, absolutely squandered potential for a franchise. Coming in at number 2 is going to be Wrong Turn, and for the longest time I would have told you definitively that this was the worst horror franchise I had ever seen until we got to my number 1. And Wrong Turn is a franchise that for a long time I never really had the interest in watching. I really enjoyed the first film when it came out. I continue to enjoy it. It's a solid 3-star Texas Chainsaw 2000s kind of ripoff. It has some good characters and some good actors in it. I think that a lot of the kills, and especially the character arcs and the way that they build out these main characters to make you care about them from the beginning of the movie, is done pretty well, especially for slasher standards. But the rest of this franchise just devolves into the absolute lowest hanging fruit you can have for straight-to-video slashers until we get to the remake. I mean, there's moments throughout the middle 4 or 5 films that are somewhat entertaining, but it's absolute trash slasher filmmaking where it's low budget. Let's crank up the gore, let's crank up all the gross, nasty elements of this, like the incest and the rape and all that, and we're gonna push that to the forefront, especially in the second film. And we're going to continue to just have these characters mutilate everybody in their path with no hope whatsoever, especially the 5th film. Wrong Turn Bloodlines is absolutely one of the most miserably nihilistic and hopeless films I have ever had the displeasure of watching. And even if I ever, for whatever reason, have to go back through these films, there's a chance that I might not even watch the 5th one again, because it's just absolutely dreadful to get through and leaves you on a note many times throughout the movie that just sours your stomach and just makes you question, like, why the fuck am I doing this to myself? Why am I experiencing this? You get to the remake. I genuinely think the remake is a very good movie. That's actually my favorite of the franchise by a skosh. I think they did a really interesting thing to hold on to some of the elements of Wrong Turn, and while taking it in a very different direction. A lot of the fans of this franchise didn't care for how different it as a direction it was and how much they abandoned with the inbred psycho hillbillies, but I really enjoyed the way that they did it with this like mountain community, and there was some really clever commentary in there on different cultures and invading other cultures, and there's a nice twists and turns throughout that kind of reshape your expectations as well as the protagonist's expectations as you go into this situation. There's some really solid gore. Just like with Hellraiser, I hope that we do get a follow-up to this because I think that it was a really solid direction to go, and I think it was a really well-made movie. Not without its faults, but I enjoyed it. So 2 movies in this franchise that I enjoy, but a number of them that I think are just examples of the worst form of slasher filmmaking, and probably my least favorite movie in this entire list in all these franchises, with the 5th film. So Wrong Turn, pretty miserable set of movies. But there's one set of movies that is ultimately a lot more miserable to get through, and that is the Children of the Corn franchise. This is one that has just kind of been in the background for a long time. I never really feared jumping into it. I was never really dreading jumping into it. It just never really interested me that much. So it wasn't until the latest remake came out last year, which, just like with Exorcist Believer, ended up in my bottom 10. It was in my bottom 5 of the year last year. It wasn't until I saw that I said, you know what, maybe it's time to finally go through the Children of the Corn franchise. And there's like 11 or 12 of these movies. I've seen the first one, I've seen the third one, and that was it, aside from the remake that I had just walked out of. And the first one that I would say pretty much 90% of people would say is the best that this franchise ever offered, I still think is a pretty boring movie. For an 80s cult classic, for an 80s Stephen King adaptation, I find it to be very dull. So I'm not even a fan of that first film. I have some decent fun with the third one. I think the third one is okay and kind of a so bad that it's good way, but that's really about it. I can tolerate the first one, and there's moments that I like, there's castings that I like. The kids are creepy with Malachi. Isaac, another really memorable character from that first film, he actually comes back in like the 4th or the 5th film or something. This is a franchise, though, that it's the same fucking thing over and over and over and over. I watched every single one of these movies within like a month, and when I got to the last one, I could not tell you a distinct plot point or something that stood out about any of these movies aside from the first and the third one if you put a gun to my head. It's the same plot. You get random characters that somehow enter and come upon this corn-fed town that is basically decrepit and empty, and there's some creepy-ass kids that hold scythes and knives and pitchforks and shit, and that's the plot every single fucking time. It was mind-numbing. It was absolutely mind-numbing. I abandoned doing the review series, and I abandoned doing the ranking, because I genuinely would have had to look at Wikipedia and make up things to say that stood out about any of these movies. And like with Sean's decision that he made with the Leprechaun franchise, very similar, I don't think I would have had anything positive to say about any of them. So it would have been a giant video of me just shitting on Children of the Corn over and over and over, basically repeating the same 2 or 3 sentences for 11 movies. And this is the only franchise that I have had that with, where I cannot sift through the rubble and tell you the bright spots or tell you the things that I enjoyed about a number of them or a couple of them. The 2 that I like are tolerable at best. So Children of the Corn, for me personally, is a franchise that I don't think there's any reason to ever reboot it again. We've seen it 1,000 times. There's nothing new to be done with it. They have proved that numerous fucking times. And so far, it is the worst horror franchise that I have ever sat through. Well, that's it for this one, guys. If you enjoyed that, please click over here for my 2024 new release reviews so far. I'm also going to put our 31 on 31 Pain and Suffering, which covers a number of these franchises for you to check out. Please check out the sponsor of this video, Babbel, down in the video description below. Like, share, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss everything in the future. And as always, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean you have to be.